Today we will discuss the crucial role a drilling fluid management plan plays in HDD operations. When developing a plan, contractors need to consider mud mixture, drilling additives, and support equipment. Mud management experts need to remain flexible to adapt to changing ground conditions. One of the key considerations they need to determine is when to pump and dump mud versus recycling it. There are many factors to consider when deciding between pump and dump and using a reclaimer to recycle drilling fluid. So Marv, first, what is pump and dump, and when is this process typically used on a job site?
What pump and dump is referring to is basically a process of where drilling fluid is pumped down the borehole. The fluid then is returned back up the borehole to an exit pit, and that fluid then is vacuumed up via a vacuum truck or a vacuum trailer system and then hauled off and disposed. So you're pumping the fluid down the borehole, you're vacuuming it up, and then hauling it off and disposing it and dumping it. So pump and dump. Very common to see this done on mid-sized projects and small utility-sized HD projects where customers or contractors are not using reclaiming system. It's a very common process that's done on a regular basis out there in the HD industry.
It normally is considered, whenever your volumes are not there too. If I'm a contractor and I go out with 500 gallons or even 750 gallons of fluid, and I'm only sucking up 500 to 700 gallons of fluid, it's not beneficial for me to keep transferring fluid around. I just go out one time with my fluid and then bring it back to the shop. So that's where pumping and dumping is. If I'm using a lot of fluid, well then I'll need to also think about disposal of that fluid.
And you talk about using either trailer vacs or truck vacs to suck up all of that drilling fluid and dispose of it. I would say as that becomes more of a topic on disposing of it, how far am I having to travel to that? I think we're seeing more contractors maybe even look to truck vacs because of the capacity in which those can hold, right? If I have an 800-gallon vac trailer on site, that's more trips to the disposal yard or to the dump site. So why are many contractors, moving away from said pump and dump method to maybe look at a reclaimer?
Government agencies and of course some of the contractors are having stricter environmental regulations placed on them. So some of the dumps that we have even 3 years ago have now closed because that is a fluid. So some people think it, even though it has a lot of solids in it, even though bentonite is just a clay, they think of it as a hazardous product. So they have to dispose of it in that way. So contractors are looking for more effective ways of being able to manage that drilling cost. Also, you have to think about, where's my source of water? So if my source of water is only 10 minutes away and my dump is only 10 minutes away, well then, pump and dump may be the way to go. It may be the most cost-efficient way to deal with the drilling fluids for that day. If one of those parameters change, then maybe we'll have to look at a recycler. For instance, if my dump is an hour out and then I have to turn around and I get caught in traffic, now I'm an hour and a half out. What does that do to my driller? He's sitting there waiting on that vac to return. So he's going to slow down his pump because I don't want to use more fluid. Well, what does that do to his bore path? It'll start caving it in. And you'll start collecting solids because now I'm not flushing those solids out. So, the lack of approved dumps, the high dumping fees all play into a role. It's just not one thing, but it's a combination of things that help those contractors move away from the pump and dump mentality and maybe pull into a reclaiming system. Again, the time to travel as far as the vacuum excavator from the dump back to the job site. In some cases, it's what is that time from the freshwater supply, and where is that freshwater supply coming from?
So I think a good example of that, we speak as pump and dump can be a viable or a cost-effective option for some of our customers out there. So telecommunications might be a great example of that. If you have a telecommunications customer who's only pulling a single 2-inch product back, it's a small hole, not a lot of fluid might be needed to complete that job.
Absolutely correct.
So the cost of which to dispose of that fluid or the amount of fluid required for that job is minimal.
Right.
What are some factors that help determine whether a reclaimer or a drilled fluid recycling system should be used?
We touched on several of them already. John mentioned, things like, where's my project in proximity to my freshest water source? What is the travel distance to my dumping site? Those are all things that factor in, but also really, what's the scope of my project? Traditionally, mud recycling systems have been utilized in the HD industry for a long time, but in a larger scale projects. And that's really related to the amount of volumes that they're dealing with on those types of projects. As your holes get larger in diameter and longer distances, when you accumulate the total volume required to do that bore, it grows exponentially as your projects get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's one of the factors, hole volume, the amount of volume of fluid that's going to be needed to do the project. You think about that if you are looking at a project that's, for example, a 24-inch diameter project, the amount of fluid that you have to supply down hole per minute to clean that bore path, to get those cuttings out of the borehole, it's very high, very, very high volumes. You can't keep up with that by just bringing in fresh water and mixing on the fly. So mud recycling systems benefit in that way, because as I said earlier, we can retain, in right ground conditions, we can generally retain 70 to 80% of that fluid we're pumping downhole. So we're able to use that fluid over and over again. Another scenario would be, what's your rate of penetration that you expect to see on a project? For example, if you're drilling in rock, generally the rate of penetration is very, very slow. Even though you might be doing a small diameter hole and pumping only maybe a very low volume of fluid, because of your rate of penetration is very slow, the amount of total volume of fluid that you're using over the course of that project is pretty substantial. So scenarios like that, in a rocky ground condition type formation, would be a benefit and could factor in as to when a mud recycling system would be beneficial to use.
So I think we've spent, several minutes here talking through the different factors of which we would look to a mud recycler or a reclaimer. John, could you provide some more detail to the benefits of which we would bring that reclaimer on the job site?
Whenever we're reclaiming that drilling fluid, we're retaining the water, but we're also retaining those additives that we put into that water to create that drilling fluid. Because a reclaimer is not going to remove the bentonite, it's not going to remove the additives. As you use additives like polymers, they will reduce as far as their ability to carry their suspension characteristics, filtration characteristics. So throughout the day, you may need to add a little more of those polymers to the job, but it's not going to take them out. It'll just shear them. You have to think about not only the drilling fluid, but the spoils that you're pushing out your bore path. You're going to have to be able to dispose of those spoils. Less time coordinating from my disposal site and vice versa. Reclaimers also minimize dump fees.
I think that labor one is a really pivotal piece. Depending on how many employees they have on hand, they might not have the amount of employees to take that truck or trailer to the dump site, or to bring fresh water on site to get the drill going again. And like we've stated in previous videos, or today even, at times the fluid management piece can restrict or have that drill just sitting idle, right? Not putting any pipe in the ground because we're not sending any fluid down hole and can't continue on. So talking through, all the different benefits of a reclaimer, one of which is they can withstand the amount of fluid that they're pumping down hole. One thing we see within the industry is, some contractors may have to limit that amount of fluid because we're of the concern of the disposal costs or the equipment running up and down the road, transporting either fresh water to the job site or that fluid disposal to the disposal site. What benefit is there on having a reclaimer on the job site where we can withstand the amount of fluid and sending that fluid down hole?
Yeah, so if a contractor is not concerned, as concerned with waiting on a vac to return, or he sees his pit filling up full of fluid, he can continue his operation if a recycler's there. So he can see it. And also the fact is, He's not waiting on the vac to return from the dump. He's not waiting for the water truck to return from the hydrant. He can continue his operation, and that's the main thing, is putting product in the ground.
The big benefit of it is too is that, you can not be concerned about turning your mud pump up and pumping more volume, which is going to lead to potentially higher penetration rates and how fast you can drill. But it's also going to do a better job of cleaning your borehole, because you're going to keep that annular velocity up in that annular space and help move those cuttings out of the borehole. So that's another big benefit of having a reclaimer versus supplying on demand type situation.
Thank you for joining our discussion on creating a plan for fluid management on an HDD operation. If you have further questions on drilling additives or support equipment, please reach out to your local Vermeer dealer or visit vermeer.com.